And we're live, kind of. Hello, everybody. Today is September 17th, and yeah, World War III might be coming about. I don't know if this will actually amount to anything, but yeah, the world's on fire. Yay!
Well, it's not going to be World War III. That wouldn't necessarily be beneficial for the state right now. I mean, it would certainly expand demand, but that's clearly not what they're doing right now. They haven't built up these ridiculous war economies where the government overtly inserts itself into a lot of areas of industry and directly controls a lot of those resources, because the only time where it can ever really present itself as being beneficial to the interests of the population it rules over to have a war economy is in a time of depression, and that's the only time a war economy is ever cost effective, is when they essentially just need to manipulate all these various different um, industry cartels they've built up. They can artificially expand the amount of revenue which they're able to obtain.
Plus, there's
Yeah.
this. Plus, there's
What were you
this.
gonna say? Sorry.
Yeah, plus there's, now that you mention it, I do remember that there was a certain amount of propaganda and rhetoric that usually precedes going into war. For example, you might see more news stories about how our perceived enemy is going to be terrorizing and killing women and children. I'm pretty the probably the most prominent example we might remember is before the Gulf War, one of the ambassadors to or the Yemenis ambassador to the U.S.'s daughter, as it turned out, made a claim to United States Congress that Saddam Hussein's soldiers were taking Kuwaiti kids out of incubators, like newborns, and just throwing them out into the street. This, of course, turned out to be completely false, and she presented this with no evidence, but this is the propaganda that they usually like to go with to try to generate sympathy in the general population, as well as to. Uh, they also like to generally operate on these big flashpoints in history, things like 9/11 or the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, they'll
Usually,
manufacture false flag events.
they'll manufacture a false flag event to try to drag us into war, and it's always going to be against some major U.S. target, all to, of course, get us into this war and to generate massive popular support for the war. As I'm sure you remember, there was 80% opposition in the United States prior to prior to December 1941 to us going into World War II, which did a complete 180 once the attack came. Of course, people won't know that it was a false flag until
Once
like the 90s or
once
something.
Pearl Harbor happened, it wasn't necessarily a false flag. Fully FDR directly commanding one of his members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think, to move a naval fleet into Pearl Harbor, which at the time was basically just strategically a suicidal move. It was basically like painting a bullseye and saying, "Here, attack," because the Japanese forces were in that area, and no one would have done that unless they were essentially expecting an attack.
Mm-hmm. And we also have communications from FDR saying that yes, this is exactly the result that he wanted to have happen. He wanted to create a provocation, which is, of course, one of the major things that the state likes to do before they go to war. Always try to initiate some provocation from their enemies. You can even see
Yeah,
this in World
so
War One, where Britain was bullying Germany like hell in order to get them to fight back. I think that there was a blockade done around Germany, around their only port, basically cutting them off from food, and the resulting famine actually ended up killing 500,000 people by any standard and measurement of any standard of understanding of reason, logic, and ethics, that's absolutely monstrous. But the elites in Britain wanted a war because they wanted an Anglo-Saxon dominated world.
What they wanted was to expand demand for their state because of the fact that at that point, they'd essentially the world had essentially moved over to full central banking at the time, and that was sort of the idea behind economic policy, quote unquote. Just keep spending, which is ironic because in a lot of these historically revisionist textbooks, you hear that that's essentially the exact opposite of what it was.
Well,
No, if you look at the sort of positions Herbert Hoover was messaging, and a lot of the legislation Herbert Hoover was right. It was basically identical to FDR. So
oh yeah.
in there's no real distinction between the two of them.
I still remember in government school when I was there, like even before I was even inclined towards anarchism, my school textbooks would talk about how Herbert Hoover would shut down banks and then try to infuse them with money. And they would talk about how short sighted and ineffective it was. But then, when the great God King FDR claimed to slay the dragon of the bad economy, he heroically had the banks shut down and then infused them with money. And that completely revitalized them. And I remember.
I think the funniest part about FDR, off topic, but yeah, Herbert Hoover greatly increased GDP spending in relation to government programs. He created a lot of these government programs. He was a protectionist, just like FDR. He created a lot of tariffs, and also tried. He created all these financial restrictions as well, which are basically just further cartelization of that already increasingly cartelizing industry.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting is that you can look at some of FDR's 1932 campaign speeches, his rhetoric, and just in general, like he ran as a libertarian free marketeer who was hitting hard against the government-centric policies of Herbert Hoover and wanted to get a return to, free market libertarianism, or at least something a little bit more free. Basically following in the President Harding example of getting the government out of the way in order to grow your way out of a recession. And
Dear Lord.
yeah,
Sorry.
and as you can imagine, no, you're a host. You can say as much as you want.
So what I think is most hilarious about FDR is him being a eugenicist, but also being in a wheelchair.
Oh, and on the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you were gonna say something. Go
Isn't
on.
that like the equivalent of being a black Klansman?
Yes, that actually is. Now, what's funny is that like FDR went out of his way to keep the illusion of him being able-bodied, even having this entire medical staff devoted entirely to giving him the illusion of being able to walk. I believe he did this thing where he had braces built for his legs and a cane, and with this really silly walk where what he would do was he would try to twist his torso to try to force his legs forward, give him a vague illusion of following. He would support himself on his cane and he would lean against whatever walls happened to be nearby so that he would look like he was basically just limping but otherwise able-bodied.
And could you imagine the amount of control that the state, had over the press, even at the time, for people to not even know that the president was in a fucking wheelchair?
Oh, it got so bad that there were movie theaters who were just straight up showing war propaganda in movie theaters. I think it was like a 5 or 10 minute reel about quote unquote progress in World War II to try to raise support and morale for the war, which of course makes absolute sense because during World War II and even during the Great Depression, the U.S. was basically a command economy.
And that's what I mean by like a war economy. But
yeah, which is of course exactly what they want, and I think part of their plan to get people used to the idea of us going to war with Iran, because I think we can all see that any war with Iran is going to escalate into a war with Russia, or at the very least be contained in a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Also, it's because, we have that looming recession, so if a war was to start right now, it would expand demand significantly for these arms manufacturers.
Pumpkin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, a few minutes ago you guys mentioned that the Pearl Harbor thing, how they were basically painting a target on their chest. I wanted to mention that they had done that during the Civil War also, when they were basically shipping ammunition right in front of the Southern forces.
It's not the only time that it's happened. I was just mentioning that because, there are two ways in which government sort of manufacture geopolitical events, which allow them to essentially justify within their socio-political framework going to war. A lot of people like to say there's just false flags. That's not necessarily true. There's also provocation, which happens a lot more often, I would argue, than false flag events, though there are documented false flag events that, have happened, such as Lusitania. I'm not even talking about 9/11, where there's even, if you were to actually uncritically look at the evidence, there's no way at this point you could say 9/11, that the official story is accurate. But, there, like, even the consensus of historians and even like government media outlets will admit, if they mention the Lusitania, that was an example of a false flag event. Not even remotely disputed at this point.
And I think the kind of stuff that's going to come out once even more documents are declassified, once the state collapses, I think there's going to be all sorts of stuff that are worse than we possibly imagined.
Why is the government comfortable talking about the Lusitania now, and how basically the U.S.'s involvement in World War I, all the people who died there were just pawns for the games of some central bankers in the state? Oh, well, because they all died over 100 years ago. Who gives a fuck about them?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, their family members are dead now, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe their children are still alive. They're old as hell, but yeah, I think it should very clearly demonstrate that the state does not care about you. They're not concerned about whether or not you live or die. As far as they're concerned, you're just statistics, you're just tax cattle to them, and you're not even valuable enough of a form of tax cattle that they genuinely are concerned about whether or not you're alive.
I think the most disgusting, I think actually that kind of pisses me off a bit more than, the fact that the government used them as pawns in the first place. The fact that, they lied for a little over 100 years, then, just about 100 years later, then they admitted it, because they knew full fucking well no one was going to care at that point. Long ago, no one who was a relative of theirs or knew them or would be able to make a stink about it and sue the government. No, they're all gone.
And of course, they're still gonna try to maintain the illusion that the war of northern aggression was a civil war, or that it wasn't. Or that Fort Sumter wasn't a direct provocation specifically to try to trigger the War of Northern Aggression.
If the state were to survive 100 years from now, how much you want to bet? 2101, the state finally admits 9/11 was a false flag event.
I'd say it's
not going to happen,
certain.
But if they were around, I could see that.
They probably would.
That is just totally vulture like predatory behavior. Kill hundreds of thousands of millions of innocent people, then yeah, wait for about a century, then admit that you did it, and watch how absolutely no one cares. I've said that 3 times now, I know, but just it's journalized, really.
It's actually really horrifying. And the reason this is relevant, or what we've been talking about, is because, well, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with what happened in Saudi Arabia a few days ago, where one of their largest oil refineries and oil plants just got destroyed by multiple drone strikes. Now,
15 minutes to get to the subject of the stream.
I mean,
The
this is
first subject.
it's still kind of important. It's important to talk about, and it's important to lay the groundwork. But yeah, so what ended up happening is that there were apparently several explosions at a oil refinery and oil plant. I forget the exact nature of the facility, but it exploded, and the result has apparently been the biggest price shock in the supply of oil in world history, because as you're well aware, Saudi Arabia is a major oil exporter. Now, Saudi Arabia, or at least not Saudi Arabia actually, well, kind of Saudi Arabia, but the U.S. government has been blaming Iran for what happened. The official story goes something like this: that the Houthis, which are a Shia Muslim minority group in the country of Yemen. Yemen is currently undergoing a civil war where one of their factions, Sunni Muslims, is engaged, or the Sunni Muslims backed by Saudi Arabia and the United States are going after the Shia Muslims, who are kind of sort of backed by Iran, except not really. Well, the Houthis, the Shia, apparently were able to do a drone strike on the oil plants of Saudi Arabia. Now, from a strategic point of view, I can understand why the Houthis would do this, because Saudi Arabia is openly supporting their enemies, and attacking Saudi Arabia in one of their biggest economic nerves is going to hurt their enemies by damaging one of their main support lines. So it makes perfect sense, like, why they would do this motive-wise. However, so far, no evidence has been forthcoming of Iran even being involved. I mean, does Iran have the capabilities to do that kind of multiple drone strike?
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people misconstruing what we've said. Oh, well, how could it be a false flag? They attacked an oil facility. Now that's just going to create scarcity of oil. If they wanted oil, why would they attack an oil facility? That's actually a straw man argument of petrodollar recycling. I mean, there is a controlled opposition narrative in the media. Like the whole Dick Cheney Halliburton thing kind of started that.
Mm-hmm.
But no, petrodollar recycling is the process of through which governments back their fiat currencies, their currencies which are printed through fractional reserve banking, by the process of using international cartels and manipulating the supply of certain commodities, or manipulating geopolitical events in order to maintain a consistent demand, or make the demand go up so that the price of their money it becomes more valuable, or just remains somewhat consistent for a short period of time. So actually, this would be creating a scarcity of the world oil supply by what is an estimate by various international environmental watch organizations have estimated. I say various because I can't remember the names off the top of my head. It's like the majority of them, except UW at this point. But yeah, they estimate that the loss the company which was actually running the facility as well estimates that the oil lost from this is going to be upwards of 150 million barrels over the course of the next year, and that's gonna shoot up oil prices drastically. So once you take into consideration that petrodollar recycling is not so much about oil, but is actually about the of various currencies backed by the price of oil, then you realize, oh, this actually makes perfect sense how it fits into that narrative, because it allows them to keep a relative stability in the value of their currency, while there's increasing debt and we're going into negative interest rates worldwide. But we'll go more into that later on.
Pretty much. So
The negative interest rate part.
yeah. So what's happening right now is the official narrative says that the Houthis did it, but of course they want to try to pin what the Houthis are doing on Iran, which is going to be they're going to try to trot that forward as a kind of provocation by Iran to justify a war with Iran. And of course, as you know, several war hawks in the U.S. government, including John Bolton, who, although he was fired from being Trump's national security advisor, is very much a kind of caliber of foreign policy expertise that surrounds the White House at this current moment. For the time being, they are quote-unquote waiting for Saudi Arabia to make an official statement on who done it. But given that Saudi Arabia, the Sunni Muslim radicals are really have a raging hate boner for Iran, they have a very clear conflict of interest in this regard. Plus, I believe the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has said that he was going to bring forward evidence that proves that Iran did it. And this isn't the first time he's made that statement in regards to proving that Iran did something, and nothing happened.
Exactly. Didn't he say the exact same thing about the oil tanker a few months back, and nothing ever came out of that? He basically just said, well, we know Iran did it.
He also said that he was going to bring forward evidence that Assad's government in Syria was responsible for the latest gas attack on civilians, which, if you recall, we did a collab about that like April of the year before. And of course, no evidence was provided because evidence did not exist. It seems to be Mike Pompeo's modus operandi to trick people into confidence by making them think like, yes, this evidence exists, and he's going to show it to us. Of course, he's not actually going to show anything. He's just trying to implant the meme into people's minds that, yes, the evidence exists. Of course it doesn't, but that doesn't really matter.
Basically, they just said, well, there's evidence, but we're not going to actually provide that evidence. Just we have evidence. And I suspect they're probably going to do the same thing here. But what I was going to say is, you say Sunni Muslim as if like the radical part is that they believe in a different tribe to Muhammad, rather than the conflict itself between Shia and Sunni Muslims being entirely based on thinking that there was a different person in that third position. Itself crazy. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, that's basically the disagreement between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Is I don't I'm blanking on, like, this is gonna make me sound like such a scrub, but I'm blanking on like the specific term that they used for the people who were close to Muhammad, basically. Mm-hmm. Priests, or the sort of wise men of Islam, like the Sheiks. 3 wise men, but their version, the sheiks. I don't fucking know.
It's a freaking I just had it. It just dropped off my tongue.
The Shia and the Sunni Muslims disagree on who the third one is in their continuity, and that's literally the only disagreement between the two of them, and that's what's been that's what's been used by those states to justify wars throughout history.
Pretty much, they just can't figure out who the third guy is, and they've been trying to figure that out for the last 1,400 years, and they still can't figure it out, probably because the evidence does not exist, and there's really no way to do it other than, well, I know it's this guy because my parents said so. Well, how do you know your parents?
You watched. On the side note, have you watched fucking politics on like memory TV that comes out of the Gulf states? The stuff that they say on their political talk shows.
I see some of the memes that come from it, but I don't watch the show specifically. I know that they say like the absolute most retarded things.
There are like, I'm sure there's got to be compilations of it on YouTube. I would recommend anybody watching to go look those up for anyone like who wants to see it, because it is hilarious. Like there's skit off. It wasn't a skit, but it may as well have been. Like, you can't make this shit up. But on memory TV. Of one of the panelists, or the host of the show. No, it was a panelist, but he said that the Jews were using SpongeBob to turn your kids gay.
Wait. The Republican Party said that kind of thing like in 2004, I think.
Seriously?
Yeah, it was around that time period. Like, they said something very, I don't know if it was like the Republican Party or just some congressman, but yeah, they said something similar. That was the thing.
They said that the Jews were doing it, or they...
No, not the Jews. But
yeah, there it is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's from Kuwait. Yeah, this guy was on TV, and that's what he said.
He didn't say that
so,
the
yeah,
Jews were doing it.
Somebody just posted it in general in the Discord server we're recording this.
Mm-hmm.
So, for anybody who is in the server right now that wants to watch it, yeah, somebody just posted it.
Yeah, but they didn't say it was the Jews doing it. They just said, like, yeah, SpongeBob turns kids gay. They're probably...
Well, this guy, this guy actually did say it was the Jews.
Probably referring to that one episode where SpongeBob and Patrick raise a baby bird, except it's not a bird. As a
clam?
What he said in the video specifically is SpongeBob behaves very feminine. So he represents a gay person, basically.
I think I recall the producer specifically stating that he was asexual.
I mean, that would be biologically correct.
and specifically his reasoning was, a bunch of the biggest Hollywood producers in America are Jews. SpongeBob behaves like a girl, and or what I perceive to be feminine behavior traits. And that's just like gay people. And this is a show targeted towards our children. Therefore, Jews are using SpongeBob to make our kids gay.
You have to look at this and you have to wonder, why exactly are we supposed to be afraid of these people?
Oh, they're hilarious. Give them radio shows.
Yeah, just by all means, keep talking. We find your ideas very enlightening, and by enlightening I mean they lighten up our days. But anyway, should we move on to a next topic?
Oh, I had a question.
Yeah. All right.
Earlier you guys mentioned Iran. Wasn't Iran being funded by the government, or was that just a narrative trick?
What period of time are you referring to?
I think it was said in like 2011, but I don't recall exactly.
I would need to know specifically. Are you talking about that gun smuggling ring, which was being run by the CIA?
I think I am.
I do think that there were cash payments from the United States to Iran as part of the Iran deal. I don't quote me on that. I'm just going off of what I remember, but I could be wrong. But I think I remember that being a thing. That's the amount that I can really think of. But for the time being, no, I don't think Iran is a puppet state of the CIA.
Okay, well that answers my question.
Yeah, I actually remember that was that Operation Fast and Furious.
That wasn't
Hence,
that wasn't to
you're talking
Iran though.
about. Thought that's what you were talking about.
Operation Fast and Furious was a program by Eric Holder's Justice Department in the Obama administration to get guns to the drug cartels in Mexico, and they would use those guns to essentially track their location. However, what ended up happening is that the government lost track of those guns completely, and the drug smugglers got the drug cartels
Well,
ended up getting free U.S. weapons.
It was part of the ATF gunwalking scandal. I remember pretty clearly.
Yeah, and
There was gun trading involving various Gulf states, one of them being Iran.
I don't think Fast and Furious was not involved in the Middle East at all. I remember
Fast and Furious wasn't, but Operation Fast and Furious was part of the ATF gunwalking scandal.
probably. And I remember seeing a story. I remember hearing stories about how people would go into Texas gun shops, request to buy guns, do background checks, finding out that these people are part of the drug cartels, fail them, and then government agents would go up to them and just be like, no, 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 let him have a gun. Yeah,
That is just crazy.
That had to
But-
be awkward.
Yeah, I'm to this day I will contend that that was done specifically to try to push the gun control narrative. Wow, look how easy it is for literal drug cartels to buy guns in the United States. We got to make sure that nobody else is allowed to have guns. However, I think that backfired completely. The program failed and broke apart before they were able to push that narrative.
Also, a lot of these drug cartels were actually started and largely are funded by the CIA. So,
Yeah, wasn't El Chapo a CIA asset?
yeah, he is still. That's how he was able to get out of prison so easily. You think that he just had, he happened to have contacts inside, sure, but why do you think they listened to him?
Because they live in Virginia, Lancaster, Virginia. But anyways,
Well, hey, we're in a Mexican prison. Why are all these Americans that are all from Virginia? They all got employed here, and they all happen to be working on El Chapo's block. Isn't that strange?
no, that sounds completely reasonable. So I think we should move on to the next story. What should we do? Vaping ban? Or
We're gonna actually make a video about that pretty soon here. But yeah,
Yeah,
if you
so-
wanted to mention that pretty quickly.
No, I don't think there's really much of a point. So let's see here. Should we talk about Julian Assange?
Yeah, for those who... Yeah, sure, we could talk about Julian Assange, but yeah, within the next few days, we're putting out a video about the vape ban. I thought after finally making my video, sort of addressing a lot of the disinformation which people were spreading, and a lot of the, I hate to use the word, but harassment I was receiving, I would be making more videos. But yeah, after finishing Libertarianism in Decay, I felt really debilitated lately, and like I just haven't felt like writing consistently, so I'm probably gonna take a break from making videos outside of those short little news segments I upload occasionally. Because yeah, on top of that, we've also got quite a few, like the FNet project. That's heating up. We've got some pretty big updates.
They're big updates, but unfortunately not something we're willing
I
to talk
wasn't
about on
going to
stream.
say I wasn't going to say anything about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, big things are happening there, which I've been devoting a lot more of my attention to that as a result.
Yeah. Meanwhile, you'll still get regular video updates from me. So
I'm glad now that we merged channels, because yeah, that would be a pain.
yay,
For people to go
content.
weeks without videos. Yep.
I love that you guys merged channels, by the way.
Thank you. And by the way,
So on to Julian Assange.
yeah, so let's see here. If you guys recall, I did a video a while back about him being taken out from the Ecuadorian embassy and all of the wheelings and dealings that the U.S. used their leverage in the IMF and the World Bank in order to get sweetheart deals for the Ecuadorian government in order to get Julian Assange kicked out of the embassy. A lot of things, while there's no smoking gun, obviously, a lot of things conveniently fell into place, such as several loans to help stimulate, quote unquote, Honduras' economy, and how the U.S. deliberately supported basically a puppet president in their election bid. And as a result, well, yeah, Julian Assange got kicked out. He was clearly not doing physically well, and then he was taken away, basically never to be seen again. Only now it's come out that, yeah, he was rapidly tried, sentenced, and despite the fact that he's fully served his sentence now, he's still going to be in prison.
And they're not even trying at this point.
I mean,
Not even trying to justify it. They're just they're just locking him up because they can't let him continue operating with WikiLeaks. He's helped WikiLeaks publish too many damning things on the state and will continue to do so.
The official story is that Julian Assange has a propensity to flee, and that's why they're keeping him in jail. However, if he's served his sentence, according to their own laws, he's a free man. He can do whatever the hell he wants.
Who gives a fuck if he does flee?
Yeah, what's he gonna be fleeing from? Oh, right, U.S. extradition, where he could possibly be facing treason charges.
The fact that they're even using the word flee itself sort of implies that he's a criminal and he's trying to escape something.
What was his original reason for fleeing?
The original reason for... Well, what had happened is that there was... the state tried to get him on rape charges. That there were some women in Sweden, I think it was, who, like two of them, who accused Assange of raping them or some sort of sexual assault. And of course, their stories fell apart like very, very quickly. And so, in order to avoid extradition to Sweden, he went to UK. And UK, unfortunately, had an extradition treaty with Sweden, so he had to go to the Honduran embassy, which Honduras does not have a extradition treaty with the U.S. or Britain or Sweden. So ideally, he was safe there. But what ended up happening is that London decided to make their trump up their own charges on him fleeing justice or whatever the name of the charge was. So because he avoided extradition, he is now guilty of avoiding extradition.
It wasn't the Honduran embassy, it was the Ecuadorian embassy, by the way.
I am terrible with names, and I know that there's going to be some Hondurans in the audience.
I haven't mentioned anything specific like for the entire stream because I just like basically I've just been blanking on all of them. I know the specific events, but I can't. That happens a lot.
Well, I mean,
I
I
know
know.
the specific events. I don't remember, like, I don't latch on to names or the names of organizations. I know the events just generally, like, enough that if you were to look it up, you'd be able to find information about it. But,
So you know what?
another thing I was going to say is that it's weird itself that the US is trying Julian Assange on treason charges, but he's an Australian citizen. He does not have a US citizenship.
They'd probably give him a U.S. citizenship just so they can justify killing him.
I don't think that would surprise anybody. No.
No, I mean that would have to be at the point where they're even more blatantly obvious about their evil.
Claiming ownership of you so that we can kill you.
Pretty much. I mean, at this point, like if they're earnestly entertaining treason charges, then they're not even operating on the pretense of due process or law or order or whatever. I mean, I think it's already obvious, at least to our audience, that if you want chaos, a disorderly society, you want a state. And if you want real law and order, what you want is anarchy. Because when you have a state, you basically create a two-tier society of the rulers and everybody else. Suffice to say,
You have an organization which is fundamentally not accountable, and the people that it claims to rule over, that it claims dominion over, have absolutely no means of, defending themselves or holding the state, accountable. The state claims that it does, but it's really just empty words at the end of the day. Oh, these people represent your interests. Yeah, but like compared to observable reality, they clearly don't. They clearly operate around systemically different interests and motivations.
pretty much. And
Like, in order for the state to function, it has to steal resources from the people it claims to rule over. That's a direct antagonism right there.
suffice to say, they're going to try to make an example out of Assange, which is what I think this whole thing is all about. Making sure that the rest of their peons don't step out of line by making the kind of hell that Julian Assange has just gone through in the last 5 to 6 years look unpleasant and not really worth what's being done, even though really all they're going to be doing is martyring him.
Oh yeah, if people were already, finding the government in most Western countries to be the least trustworthy organization in the entire country, they should just wait until they killed Julian Assange. If whatever they feared about, what Julian Assange would do if he were, free, quote unquote, again, oh, they should wait to see what the response is to killing him.
Yeah, goodbye any semblance of legitimacy left. I mean, do they have any legitimacy at all, aside from what their propaganda
Yeah,
is believing?
normies, no, not really. But this is like enough to make people, even normies, state skeptical. That this is like that level of bad for the state in terms of optics. Shows completely, systemically, if the state will get whatever it wants, and you have absolutely no means of holding it accountable or ensuring, that the state doesn't use force against you.
Maybe that's why they want to keep Julian Assange locked up, so that if he's free, he can basically just do whatever he wants. People, like his followers, can get connected. He can gain access to the internet, that sort of thing. And what happens, like when he's locked up, is that give it 1 or 2 or 3 years, and eventually his name will fall off the public consciousness, and then they can just execute him quietly without anyone being the wiser.
Yeah, it's not going to work now, especially with how there doesn't exist a bottleneck of information. That's like a 90s intelligence agency cheese tactic. That's not going to work today because the entire way through which information is communicated, the networks are entirely different.
Once it's on the internet, it's on there forever.
You can try and bury it, but it's going to be, international news regardless.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that'll also probably, that'll be pretty damn telling once this story, if they do kill Julian Assange at any point, and the news media, every single outlet, including the controlled opposition ones, just bury it and start talking about whatever. Watch the other hand story that they're talking about to try and distract people from the fact they just did that.
Oh, look, another Malaysian airline went down. Let's watch that for frickin' 5 months.
Jordan Peterson got a cup of piss thrown in his face by a transgender black person.
Yeah, they're gonna do that. Don't think there's any, I haven't really been following the news that much, but don't know if there's any watch the other hand stories being put forward right now aside from the Brett Kavanaugh stuff trying to distract us away from what's going on in Saudi Arabia. And
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think I just circled back to where we started from, and in addition to that, I lost my train of thought. Anyways.
Sorry.
What were you going to say, Pumpkin?
I actually forgot, but they were discussing 9/11 in the chat earlier. I just thought I'd mention that Keith Knight put up a 6-hour documentary on it if anybody's interested.
6 hours?
I
Yes.
haven't seen Keith Knight's video, but yeah, James Corbett has a couple of documentaries. 9/11 Follow the Money is probably the most comprehensive one out of all of them.
It's a compilation of all of those that he did, yeah.
Oh, so it's just a compilation of the Corbett documentaries.
Yes.
All right. Well, yeah, then I think the only one you need to watch is 9/11 Follow the Trillions, but yeah, the one about the Saudi royal family is pretty damning as well, and their financial connections to the Bush administration and Osama bin Laden.
Say, what did happen to that 2.3 trillion that was announced as just missing on 9/10/2001?
Nobody knows.
Ooh, spooky.
It was never explained. It was completely bodied and buried up by 9/11.
Weird.
I think it evaporated.
Yeah, I mean, every time I open my wallet, sometimes I just see dollars just vanishing. The dollars just get Thanosed. It's really weird.
At $2.3 trillion, though, Jesus, that's like most entire governments don't have that much.
No.
That's that's $2.3 trillion. That's an entire percent of the national debt.
And how much did Trump want to increase
5%,
the defense spending by again?
It's 5%, and it was $1 trillion.
Good lord.
That's another story in and of itself. That defense spending this year increased $1 trillion. It increased by $1 trillion. That's not. It was 800 billion, and then increased to $1 trillion. No, it increased by $1 trillion, and it was already 800 billion.
What does Trump imagine we need to defend ourselves against?
Falling rocks?
It has nothing to do with defense. You and I both know that they're trying right now to find as many ways to start a war with Iran as possible.
Mm-hmm.
on, basically. So
And
I
clearly,
suppose this is probably more evidence that they're trying to start a war with Iran sometime soon, is the fact that they're literally anticipating it.
and of course, they're
And
going to try to do it on the basis of, oh, we need a strong national defense. Why do we need
Weren't
a
they?
strong national defense? Because.
I thought it looked like they were also trying to start a war with Russia too.
Well, they want to start a war with the Russia sphere in general because, well, China and Russia are trading outside of the petrodollar. That is verboten. And Iran is a strong ally of Russia and China's.
a couple countries even the EU recently, a couple countries within the EU are gonna start trading with their own gold-backed currencies. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
But yeah, I'll have to. Yeah, fuck. It's probably buried a couple pages back in resources in my server. But yeah, I'll have to. I linked you that. Oh,
Oh, wait. Isn't it that thing about a lot of European countries are de-dollarizing?
yeah.
Whew. Yeah, that's going to be. That's. We're going to. I guess those countries need democracy.
And
We need to bring,
before
we need to bring
War
democracy to
between
the Fourth
EU.
Reich.
War between the Fourth Reich and the U.S. when
Please.
before the government starts like 15 wars.
Knowing the U.S., they probably would. Or at the very least, they'd find
God,
some justification. So it's like, oh, look at what Germany's doing to American children, and they have some like very poorly animated CGI film of kids being thrown into thrown off cliffs, 300 style.
Did you see that Guy Verhofstadt speech recently that he gave for the Liberal Democrat Party convention? I think it was in the UK.
No, I didn't.
It's as if he was like taking lessons from somebody how to like imitate the body language of Adolf Hitler in his speech. That's how he looked. It was crazy. It's I swear to God, it's almost as if he was doing it on purpose.
He might have been. I mean, Hitler is known for his uh, dynamic stage presence and his emphatic use of hand gestures, and he probably did study them in order to try to mimic them. Only problem is that when people recognize what you're doing, it's kind of weird and creepy.
Watch this without audio. Like just I'm gonna put this in general, and if you're recording, if you're not, just people in here, watch this without the audio playing and tell me that this doesn't like he doesn't look like Hitler when he's talking here. Are you watching, or
Yeah,
what's
I'm,
with the dead air?
the dead air is just because I'm watching it right now, and
And you're playing it on the recording, right?
yes. However, I currently don't have anything. People on the recording aren't going to see it.
Oh, when we upload it. God damn it.
Should we imagine him with a stupid mustache too?
Probably.
Like
He looks.
easy. Look at his hand. Look at his body language. It's hunched over. He's got his shoulders on the table, and he's doing those really like clawed fingers, hand gestures. He looks like fucking Hitler. It's. I know I've said that, but I don't know how I can emphasize that. Then you look at what he's saying. We need a European empire. It's someone who someone who is going in this trying to, caring about optics does not present themselves like this and talk like this.
I'm telling you, this is. I call the EU the Fourth Reich. There's nothing else to call it. Only instead of it's only instead of Europe uniting along military lines, it's diplomatic, but it's still very much the same. An authoritarian uh, world conquering military superpower seeks to ruin everybody's day.
Somebody in the chat said the EU SSR.
Sounds about right. Yeah, someone posted a video of one of Hitler's speeches. Let's compare and contrast. Yeah, I'm just trying to look through it right now. Only problem is that it keeps cutting away from Hitler, so we can't really like see more. Like right now he's just standing there, opening his mouth, saying words. I'm not playing audio at all. I'm just trying to compare gestures.
Yeah, if he's God forbid you play fucking Hitler audio, this stream will get taken down like the moment it's up.
Yeah, I can already see several differences. Like Hitler has is clearly gets a lot more into it. You can see like he has his movements and the way he carries himself is a lot more stiff and rigid. That might just be the kind of difference in the clothes that he's wearing, but it's also like in his.
That's probably the recording too, because you can tell just by looking at the recording that there are a lot fewer frames for every second here.
Probably.
Yeah, Guy Verhofstadt, I mean, yeah, he didn't present himself being as angry as Hitler, but he was using, a lot of the same hand gestures. I was talking about being a geopolar political empire.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, you know what? That's, he looks like Hitler and he's talking like Palpatine.
A safe and secure society.
It just occurred to me, like, while I was talking, while I said that, I was like, oh yeah, that sounds, suspiciously like that speech towards the end of Revenge of the Sith.
Well, I wonder why. Maybe it's because it's the exact same speech. I mean, honestly, Europe, listen. I know no EU officials are ever going to hear me, but if they are, stop using the rise of the empire as a guidebook. It's meant to be a cautionary tale. The same thing with 1984. 1984 is not a reason why we should obey authority. It's a cautionary tale of what overwhelming authority looks like.
That's assuming that their goal isn't to create as close as what could be realistically possible to a government like in 1984 or the Galactic Empire.
I don't know if that's their goal, but it's going to be the end result. Just simply because that's going to be a logical consequence of them trying to get as many resources from as many people as possible in the most efficient manner. Now, of course, the main problem with what George Orwell conceived is that he couldn't conceive of a way that the 1984 style government would collapse under its own weight.
Yeah, and of course, that's not going to be the end result. Because, those governments are not actually possible as close as they can get, because the incentive structures of governments, based on the sort of exponential growth that exponential growth curves they operate around, the fact they have to constantly increase spending, that's just going to compel them to get to a point where they either expand to being these 1984-esque dystopias or collapse under their own weight, given that the former is literally impossible due to diseconomy of scale and the economic calculation problem. It's always going to be the latter. That's why so many governments collapse and have collapsed throughout history. The Roman Empire just being probably a great example.
Yeah. Now, I think we should go into negative interest rates now.
Sure.
Yeah, so we got several European nations that are already going into negative interest rates, and the Trump administration, specifically Donald Trump himself, repeatedly stating on Twitter, and presumably making communications with members of the Federal Reserve in person or over the phone or whatever, saying that he wants negative interest rates. Now, it's worth noting that I'm assuming you all know what negative interest rates mean. I mean, I've talked to people in real life about this, and the idea of negative interest rates makes no sense to them. But I'll just assume that you guys know. But the important thing I think everybody needs to know about negative interest rates is that modern monetary theory requires a source of deposits from which banks may fund themselves. And of course, deposits from people ordinarily having their savings accounts in banks are simply not going to suffice, especially in the US, where the average person does not have more than $1,000 in savings in the bank right now. So what they're going to need to do, and this is what's happened in Europe and all those countries that have negative interest rates or are about to have negative interest rates, is that they require, by law, all pension funds to be put into treasury bonds. So what's going to happen in the United States is that by law, they're going to require IRAs and 401ks, which are financial tools by which people put a portion of what they earn into a retirement account that allows it to grow without it being taxed. They're going to require that to be put into a treasury bond. Now, it's going to start out with a very small amount, like say 0.5% of people's 401ks get put into a treasury account. But the important thing here is that by artificially increasing the demand of treasury bonds, they can lower the yield that these treasury bonds produce and possibly even move it into the negative. This allows the government and banks in addition to be able to finance negative interest rates, because it also creates a source of deposits from which they can charge people who have the deposits. So negative interest rates, if you recall, means that you lose money when you have savings, and the bank pays you to take out a loan. And of course, they need to get that money to pay you to take out a loan from somewhere. They get those from the freaking hell, I'm blanking right now. They get those from the pensions that are going to be required to be there by law. And that's going to be the source. So the important thing that you need to take away is that when the US government, whether it be Congress or regulatory or even imperial decree, just by fiat, they decide that 401ks and IRAs are now going to be forced to be put into treasuries, that means negative interest rates are coming, and if you have any savings in the bank, take it out immediately. There's not going to be a run in the banks because the overwhelming majority of people aren't going to know this. But you're going to want to do that as soon as they start putting pensions into treasury bonds. I don't know if I explained that as best as I could, but I think I've communicated the relevant information.
Yeah, that's pretty telling. Speaking of Donald Trump's Twitter, I'd be surprised if you didn't mention this, and I didn't think you were going to, but yeah, shortly after, Saudi Arabia got bombed, I shit you not, Donald Trump puts out a tweet in all caps. It's just one tweet. It's not a thread. And his tweet reads in all caps, quote, "plenty of oil."
Yeah, I remember you posting that.
I could not believe that was real. That I thought that was a parody account at first, or I thought that picture was that picture was fake. But no, I think that's a perfect example of where government narratives are in pursuit of trying to further one narrative. They end up being tone deaf and just and fortunate implications regarding another.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the narrative behind that was, oh, well, look at all these U.S. oil reserves. So there's not going to be a scarcity. Don't worry about the international markets. But yeah, the fact that it was a military conflict associated with oil that puts images of, Halliburton back into people's minds.
And now,
Or petrodollar recycling for, the people who are actually informed.
Someone in the chat says, "So Trump is a neocon after all."
I am.
I'd say that the the neocon label itself is intended to push a controlled opposition narrative, which is that there are a certain group of conservatives who they push for war and all this stuff, and because there's no real specific parameter for what a neocon is, and there's nothing which actually excludes someone from being a neocon. You could say literally anybody's a neocon. It's a meaningless label. But another thing is that who is or isn't a neocon is essentially entirely dependent on what's politically expedient for the master narrative at the time. A great example of this was Lacey Graham was a neocon until he started vocal about defending Kavanaugh back in around this time in 2018. Then he's just like Trump. He's a good boy who didn't do nothing and is just trying to be. He's trying to work within the government to represent our interests.
I don't remember when was the last time anyone went to the government that represented anyone's interests except their own individual interest.
Or I've heard Ted Cruz called the neocon pretty much throughout the 2016 election. Then he was, then he started buddying up to Trump, and because it was politically expedient to do so, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Then he got, that narrative changed, and then there's also, the people who previously were being painted as these good boys who are now presented as neocons, such as Bill O'Reilly, Apple, or Glenn Beck.
Pretty much.
But the entire underlying idea behind calling someone a neocon is it's to imply that they're somehow different from a Republican, and as a politician, they're self-serving. If a correct politician isn't supposed to be self-serving, they're supposed to work on behalf of our interests. That's what a politician does. Is in function. These are just corrupted actors.
Oh, definitely different. And it's not like all of them are going to experience the same pressures and interests that is going to completely distract them from any ideals that they might have already had and eventually corrupt them. I mean, I think I've told you before.
Oh yeah,
that
a lot of people throw out the term neocon in sort of the same way people throw out deep state actors. It doesn't mean anything. It's a meaningless term, and it's only designed to sort of create an obfuscation narrative where, oh, it's not what's happening right now. This absolutely isn't the result of some systemic problem with the government, or it's not this. Don't question, the fact that political authority is the reason that this even happened in the first place, or the threat of legislation. No, it's just some corrupted individuals who aren't using the system properly.
Oh, to add to what you... Oh, sorry.
I'm gonna say, because I was just gonna say there's dead air here, and I think it's because Filthy is arguing with this Chaser guy while he's supposed to be streaming.
Well,
But what were you
Speaking
gonna say?
Speaking of Chaser, he decided to add to what you said. He said, neocons are pro-war. And I'm glad he said this because it means every single politician is a neocon.
Yeah. So even if they say that they're not pro-war,
they're going to be pro-war.
yeah, they sort of so back the narrative, which would lead one to believe that war would best represent their interests. You know, because that's what a lot of these anti-war politicians, quote unquote, will say. Oh, well, we need national defense, and we just need to look good diplomatically. Well, it's pretty easy to twist that to, oh, well, we need we need a big military.
When you look
Well,
at
that's what national defense is. And also, what would look good diplomatically is to go over and bomb some brown people.
obviously, I mean, you can just look at U.S. history and war, and all of the false flags and provocations that the United States was deliberately engaged in, and you come to the conclusion very fast that the U.S. looks absolutely horrific diplomatically.
Let's bomb some sand niggas.
Let's
Well,
bond.
yeah, it's a geopolar political empire. It's exactly it. The U.S. right now is basically exactly what the EU is trying to become.
And
So-
exactly what the Soviet Union used to be.
I mean, tell me, aside from the fact that the U.S. government doesn't have direct control over direct legal control over how all resources are distributed. Outside of that, I mean, the line even there is really thin because the U.S. government has all of these state-sponsored international finance cartels and industry cartels set up all over the world, designed to operate around its interests. And internally, it doesn't directly. It has basically sort of the fascist approach, where the state doesn't directly control how people or manage their resources in legal commerce, but they use finance manipulation and regulatory capture to manipulate the supply of the commodities on the market, or how easy it is to obtain loans to start a business, or who can obtain loans and under what circumstances, basically so that they can set up a small handful of politically favored conglomerates which operate around the states at beck and call, essentially. And that's the sort of market that we have, and really the degree of separation between that and the USSR, it's very slim. It's almost non-existent.
It's just cosmetic at this point. One of them outwardly dominates the economy, like they just do it. The other one pretends that it doesn't.
The main difference, though, is that the government doesn't, claim ownership to all resources, which this is just kind of proof of what I've been saying, which is that legislation, it only really has a social effect, and that's sort of how it's intended to work. Governments provably cannot work around force, so because they're outnumbered in the United States, so legislation is intended almost more for a propagandistic purpose of trying to set up a secure socio-political order so that people have asset security within a state society and don't feel like the state is being antagonistic towards their interests. Not specific acts of legislation, but like the concept of legislation and how it's sort of conveyed through the state's narrative it's not because of this you have asset security. You can point to various examples of this. Because of regulation, you have asset security. Because of because of basically every area where the government is involved.
Yeah. Were you finished?
Which assumes the government needs to exist. That is sort of underlying that argument. That sort of worldview is being implied in that argument. But yeah, the notable difference between directly declaring dominion over all resources and controlling how they're distributed is that now the economic calculation problem isn't really a thing, whereas under command economies, it would be a problem. Now, these corporations, it's small enough, like there are only a handful of state secured legal producers for every industry, and they all associate with a handful of financial cartels. So basically that whole system exists just to make it easier for the state to collect revenue more consistently, because there are fewer legal outlets through which people could obtain their resources from. So it serves the same, it basically serves like the way companies and banks are operating in the current economy is identical in function to how they would under a command economy. It's just that to avoid the economic calculation problem, the state uses proxies. They set up these cartels, and they sort of manipulate things to where that conclusion is the same, like to where people as with their resources in the same way as they would under a command economy. It's really kind of devious, but in a strange way, I find it kind of interesting, just the way that that's happened.
It's very devious, and I think they've had a lot of time to plan this out. For one thing, like, it's very clear that they wanted to improve on the mercantilist model. However, the previous mercantilist model, as it was, with its blatant monopolies and government subsidies, was not possible. So what they did was they just changed things around to make it more profitable. But fundamentally, the principles are the same: government dominion over people's ability to exchange resources, and de facto dominion over the resources themselves. But for the
It's
time
not
being,
really. Sorry.
yeah, I was just gonna say, like, yeah, we should probably be wrapping up the show.
I was just going to say one last thing, which is if you actually like read Adam Smith, David Ricardo, or even these liberal philosophers like Thomas Paine, Thomas Hobbes, um, John Locke, liberalism really was just a critique of the mercantilist economy, at least from the the trade perspective of it. A lot of people are portraying it like, oh, it was this philosophy of freedom. I mean, there were absolute monarchists, Thomas Hobbes being the best example and most well-known example, who identified as liberals. The only thing that really in common is that they critiqued the mercantilist economic model, and that's the one thing that they all had to say about it is clearly this is a bad thing. The government these this direct control over all the resources, that's not sustainable. That's just going to create artificial scarcity. That wasn't even really their main criticism. Their main criticism was the sort of the heavily protectionist nature towards all imports that mercantilist states had at the time. But yeah, that was their main issue. It wasn't even really free markets. It was more, oh well, here are the problems with mercantilism. We just need, mercantilism is fine and the state is fine. It's just in order for the state to prosper, these things need to change. That's what liberalism is. It was never proposed in order to make people freer. It was just that happened to be, people happened to have a greater degree of autonomy over their own lives because they had greater access to resources as a consequence of the liberal critique of mercantilism, and that's what led to liberalism being spun as a philosophy of liberty. It has a lot, like, I'd say a good half of the liberal philosophers a lot of people cite were pretty open were pretty openly hostile towards any sort of individualism or political liberty.
All right, and with that, we're gonna end the show here. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. Bye.